Conquest of Bliss, a podcast about finding light in the darkness.
This episode was produced by Cabby Productions.
Hello and welcome back to the Conquest of Bliss. I am here with Yohan John, and he is a neuroscientist, and he's here to talk a little bit about happiness and how it works in the brain. So we'll start first with, how are you today, Yohan?
Feeling pretty good.
That's fantastic. So I found you on Quora, among other places, because you go out of your way to help people to better understand how this stuff works. So I guess before we get into some of the nitty gritty, what led you to the helping side of this?
There's a bit of a story there. Well, I am a computational neuroscientist, so that's sort of theoretical and a little abstract and maybe not super useful yet from the perspective of medical neurology. And even a lot of experimentalists don't necessarily use a lot of it. So it's a little bit of a niche field. And when I was doing my PhD, I was perfectly happy with that. I was satisfying my curiosity. And I would tell people, well, maybe one day down the line, a few decades from now, some of these ideas will come in handy. Mm-hmm. And I never really thought of myself as the sort of person who could help anyone. Mm-hmm. And then right towards the end of my PhD, a friend of mine and I went to a symposium on music and neuroscience at Harvard, actually. It was a one-day symposium in 2011, I believe. And it was really something. It was mainly focused on neuroscience as a form of therapy and how it helped people with a whole lot of severe injuries, including war veterans, and how learning music helped them a lot, not just with motor control and physical movement, but also a sense of well-being. Now that I was quite moved by all of this, and for whatever reason, I never thought of that I could be the sort of person who could help. But then I thought, well, I must do something. I should try and give back, because I've been given this opportunity to learn, and it's funded by the NIH and the National Science Foundation. It's taxpayer funded. So in some sense, it would be nice to give back. And so I at the symposium, I flipped to the back page of a notebook and wrote down a list of things that I could write about. Because I thought, well, I like writing. I used to blog a lot just for friends. And I thought, let me write about some big topics that maybe kind of fall between the cracks of science and philosophy and sometimes even spirituality and art, and try and express them in a way that is accessible and not complicated and not condescending towards the reader. And I wrote this list of maybe 10 or 15 topics, which I started writing there. And then I started writing a column for this blog called 3 Quarks Daily. Mm-hmm. And from there, I thought I want some more practice with pop science writing. And the idea was that to try and learn how to explain things to people and see what they actually want to know. Mm-hmm. That's the story there.
That's incredible. So just to clarify, a symposium is like a conference, but fancy, right?
Well, it's sort of like a small version of a conference.
Okay.
It could be one day or one afternoon or something.
But it's like a people gathering around a topic to discuss it. Maybe there's speakers, that kind of thing.
Right.
Okay.
It was like maybe 6 or 7 speakers.
Oh, okay. That totally makes sense. It's funny because I hear the word symposium and I think of the word symphony. So what was the first topic that you decided, like what was the first, do you remember? It's okay if you don't. What's the first topic on that list or the first thing that you tackled?
I started writing about metaphor. And it might not be clear immediately why that's related to the brain, but it is related to the mind. And a thread that I've been very interested in for a long time is to understand what metaphors and analogies are. Mm-hmm. And I think having a good perspective on metaphor and analogy helps you think about what science is and what certain really powerful aspects of human thinking are. Every person uses metaphorical and analogical thinking. And very rarely are we shown how amazing this form of thought is. So that was the focus. So I started early on writing about the nature of metaphor.
And that I can see how that would connect to the brain, right? Because the idea of being able to look at one idea and relate it to another idea, like that's got to be, like, I don't know if it's synapses or what, but there's some kind of connectors in the brain, right, that help us to connect these things.
Well, the interesting thing is it's so advanced as a topic that it's hard to study directly. And in neuroscience, we try to look at people do study human language and stuff like that, and you can stick people in a scanner, but in one of those big brain scanning devices, the temporal resolution is kind of minutes, so it's much slower than the time when you actually think about a metaphor.
You can't capture it quickly
so
enough.
You're kind of looking at a very fuzzy picture, and it would be pretty hard, if not impossible, to say that you're looking at an animal coming up with a metaphor. So it's so you can't really look at it in lab animals.
That makes sense.
So people are definitely interested in it, but it's hard to really come up with a theory that you can test. So you get a lot of speculation.
That's fair. That makes sense. Yeah. So I did have a question that I'm just interested in, as far as and it kind of does that crossover with philosophy and brains and stuff like that. And it's about sort of like the filters that we use to see the world through. Is that something that you've studied much, and how we can sort of change those filters and stuff like that?
I'd argue that anyone interested in perception and cognition in the brain is implicitly studying those filters.
Okay, yeah.
Because everything from object recognition onwards is, in a sense, a filter. So you could think of it like this. How do you recognize what a dog is? If you saw a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, they're so different from each other.
Yep.
So it's actually still an open question, a big mystery, how you're able to recognize that they're the same. Obviously, being a kid and being taught what a dog is a big part of it. But you don't need to be shown every single dog on earth in order to know what a dog is. Nor do you need to be given a list to say a dog has this, and this. Because even something like a dog has 4 legs, well, that's not always true. You do see occasionally a dog that only has 3 legs or something. So so we filter in the sense that we take in all the variety and variation in the world, and we create categories. And the categories kind of sit on top of what we see and help us like tools with which to see the world.
Yeah, to make sense of it, because otherwise it's too much, right?
Exactly.
Otherwise it's just like too much information and your brain can't decide. So a question that I have following up on that would be like, is there like flexibility there? Like if you recognize that you're filtering something through something that's maybe incorrect because of trauma or different things, is there any known ways to work on that, to change that?
You could say that the entire history of both religion and philosophy have been attempts to do that. All of education is like that. And I don't just mean book learning. The learning how to dance or learning music, learning to meditate, learning any sort of technique, learning a sport. Yeah. All of these things are ways of acquiring new filters with which to see the world. Learning science is definitely one of them. And definitely the emotional filters, the filters by which we decide what to value and what to not value, are very hard to change. But over the course of a couple of thousand years, if not longer, people have accumulated a few techniques. And neuroscience is only just starting to get into this stuff. So if you're thinking about it from a practical perspective, those techniques, the ones that suit you, it could be dancing, it could be learning how to cook, it could be knitting, it could be any of these things. You probably want to find that first, and then you can look into the neuroscience if you're curious about how it works. But neuroscience doesn't really know necessarily. We're still making baby steps.
But it is observable, right? Like you can see that out, like you were mentioning with people like war veterans, and you can see that it's changing their sense of well-being by learning, musical skills or things like that.
Right. But those things are observed most reliably without even looking at the brain. So you just look at the output.
Okay.
So you treat the person as a black box, which is what everybody does anyway. And the brain does what it does, which we try to figure out. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So it's, well, if the person seems to be better, then we say, okay, they must be better.
That makes sense.
Or if they've changed either for better or for worse, we use that. And when you're studying the brain, you have to start with those things. So if you say, oh, look at this person, they've changed, let's say because of trauma or some negative experience, what people do is they compare people who've gone through that experience with people who haven't. And most of these big studies that involve large numbers of people are trying to compare different groups. They call it the control group for the people who weren't affected, and the other group could be schizophrenia patients, autism patients, different sorts of
PTSD or
people who are experiencing something. It need not be like suffering. It could be even just a small difference in behavior, and we get clues about which parts of the brain are involved. And from those studies of humans, and then all the more detailed studies you can do in rats and monkeys and mice and fish, and there's lots of different types of lab animals people study. We know that the brain is constantly changing, and at every time scale that you care to look, there's something dynamically going on in the brain.
Really?
Not just in terms of activity, but in terms of its structure.
That's so cool.
Most of the changes are pretty small in terms of how, like, they're literally their size, but they are the basis for all learning. So if I were to tell you the name of some website and you decide to remember it, you're changing the structure of your brain in a minor way.
Oh my goodness.
Because how else would you remember it?
That makes sense. It totally makes sense, but I've never thought of it before. That's so cool. And like, do we, I mean, as in like, humankind or people who know these things, do we understand things like memory very well?
We've accumulated a lot of data, so we have some ideas, but I would say that we've only scraped the surface.
Okay.
So in some sense, what's interesting about, say, the past 50 to 70 years of memory research is that we can more clearly articulate how mysterious it is by virtue of what we've seen. So, for instance, starting in the 50s or 60s, I think it was 50s, there was a person who, in Canada actually, who experienced, he had severe epilepsy.
Okay.
So as a treatment, they did a pretty intense surgery where they removed a huge chunk of the brain called the hippocampus.
Okay.
On both sides of in both hemispheres, and they also removed a little bit of the amygdala also. But he completely lost the ability to form new memories.
Oh.
He was known by his initials HM for decades because they were studying him, and it was amazing. The experimenters who were basically meeting him every day for years, they had to introduce themselves to him every half an hour or so because he forgot who they were. He could remember things from before he got the surgery. It did actually help with the epilepsy, but it came at a great cost. But he himself was not really aware of the cost of it because he didn't remember any of it. He was able to learn what you might call habits. So he could gradually become better at playing certain kinds of games or walking home, I believe, was one of them. But it was more like an instinct. He didn't necessarily know how he knew these things.
Yeah, he
And
wasn't
was
like
not
recalling them. It was just kind of in a different part of the brain, probably.
precisely. So there's two types of memory that you can talk about. What he lost is known as episodic memory. So the word episode is sitting in there. So it means the kind of autobiographical memory that most people would think of when they say, oh, I remember this or I remember that, when it's something that happened to them. There's other kinds of memory. So along with episodic memory, there's another type of memory that you can state out loud, which is facts and names and figures.
Okay, yeah.
We call that semantic memory, like knowing somebody's name or knowing some historical fact or the year such and such event happened. And then you have what's called procedural memories, which are knowing how to ride a bike, knowing how to slice onions in the right way, or any sort of technique, knowing how to knit.
And so that's what we would call muscle memory normally, right?
People often call it muscle memory, although the memory is in the brain.
Yeah.
There may be slow changes right before you reach the muscles, but most of the memory is in the brain.
That's so interesting. So we don't have a lot of information about memory, but we do have information about where it's stored, obviously, or different types of memory are stored. What about, and this is just a question that I think is, I'm not sure if you'll have an answer. This is a question that I think about a lot. And I wonder, do we know how belief works? You know, when we have information or when we have like situations where we don't have all the information and we believe something in one way or another, do we know how that works?
Well, to a first approximation, I should say that we don't know how anything works in the brain, but that's also slightly unfair in the sense that we've collected all sorts of data on things that are relevant to these topics, but it's almost like we've collected lots and lots of puzzle pieces, more puzzle pieces than we initially expected, and we're only just about starting to put them together.
Okay.
But we still don't know if we have all the pieces. We may need millions more pieces in order to fit this puzzle together. So belief is pretty complicated because, again, can't really study it that well in mice or monkeys, except for very simple things like maybe does the monkey know that there is a fruit in the box or things like that. And those are sort of like beliefs, but they're not like complicated human beliefs, say about other people, about metaphysical questions, or about good and bad, which are harder to talk about.
Okay, that makes sense, but that's so interesting. The reason I'm asking is someone asked me recently, not asked me, they asked a group that I'm in, you know, can you change your beliefs? And there was a lot of answers on either side about whether or not we can change our beliefs. And like, you know, if you're not fully convinced of something, you know, is that possible, or are you just lying to yourself? And I thought that was a really interesting question. And I have no idea if there's an answer to it. So I thought, oh, maybe you'll know.
People definitely do change their beliefs. But, and again, just looking at the fact that people go from being religious to being atheists, or atheists to religious, or having one opinion in science or one hypothesis and changing your mind, that happens all the time. It's just that the process by which it happens doesn't necessarily involve working through all the arguments for and against. The emotional and aesthetic side of a human being always comes into play. So, and of course, random events can kind of tilt you in one way or the other. You may have a strong, like a very stereotypical belief about some person, and someone will argue, no, don't believe that. Not everyone is like that. And they will continue to believe that. But then they meet one person actually of belonging to that group that they've been stereotyping, and that changes their mind completely.
Yes.
This can happen. So we often think that beliefs are formed by words floating around in the mind, sentences floating around in the mind. But it's more complicated than that. The words that you use to express your beliefs are kind of the tip of the iceberg. And how deep that iceberg goes is still unknown. We ourselves don't know how deep all that goes.
Okay. Okay, and now I've got a question that's somewhat more related to happiness, which is kind of, and like to me, all of these questions have been related to happiness, but I can understand why people might not think they are. But what about, the subconscious mind and the conscious mind and the relationship to it? Are we any closer to understanding that?
In one sense, people can't agree on what the mind is to begin with. Some neuroscientists would like to say that the mind is just the brain, or the mind is just another way of looking at the brain. And there's some truth in that, because whenever you have a cup of coffee or a drink, a beer or something, you know that the physical part of you is affecting the mental part of you, the psychological part. They're closely linked. But so what did you were saying that
the relationship between the subconscious and the conscious mind? Do we have any information there?
Well, you could say that the majority of things happening in the brain are unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know anything about, say, some particular neuron firing away right now. I have no idea about it. All I can do is speculate about it. And which is why people 1,000 years ago had no idea about neurons. There was no way you could introspect your way into experiencing a brainwave, for instance.
Yeah, and if you did, people would probably, like, you wouldn't understand what you were experiencing. Like if you had some kind of, defective moment where your brain was like, giving you more information than you needed, you'd be like, oh my gosh, what the heck?
Precisely.
So you said unconscious. So I wonder, like, and I'm just trying to, unpack some of the ideas that are often talked about more philosophically. So is there a difference between, like, when I think of unconscious thought versus subconscious thought, I'm thinking like unconscious thought would be like, like me moving my hands together, or, like the millions of processes that are going on all the time. And then when I think of subconscious thought, I think of those things like where our beliefs are rooted, the things that we were taught a really long time ago, like almost like the things that affect our perspective, but don't seem to have language to tell us directly. And so it comes out in our behaviors and stuff like that. Is there an actual distinction there?
So the word subconscious was around sort of just before Sigmund Freud, and I think he made it popular, but then he himself kind of stopped using it because it kind of creates this impression that there's like a surface and there's something underneath it. Sub is like subterranean or something like that, and that metaphor is not always helpful. So he started to just use the word unconscious. So everything that you say about the subconscious can also, you can just map that onto the unconscious.
Okay.
Because we don't have a good way of distinguishing between beliefs and everything else that has affected you. So you're constantly being influenced by every single thing that happens to you, whether you're aware of that, of those things or not. So it's not just the events that happen, but even things that you just ambiently happen to be around. For instance, it's well known that little kids can kind of pick up on the moods that their parents are expressing, even if they're not expressing it verbally. And they don't even have to be flailing around. There are subtle ways in which children and also animals can pick up on the mood of a person without any kind of linguistic clues. So that's constantly happening with people, with animals, with the nature around you, the trees and plants and the weather. Everything is influencing you, and little memories are forming and habits of response. Humans are very good at imitating. So a lot of our unconscious reactions or things that we would maybe rather not do are things that we've picked up from our family members, from school, from friends, from the media. They're all sort of like seeds planted that have become trees of behavior. So separating the little habits that you've learned that help you, say, when you go to a shop, you know what to do in a supermarket. You can't. It's not easy to separate those things that you've learned from say, other patterns. Like some people, based on the culture that they were brought up in, might feel a lot of guilt, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that needs to be taught, because clearly not all cultures have the equal levels of guilt.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And not all cultures necessarily have a strong emphasis on individuality.
Oh, yes.
So these are things that definitely the culture installs in you. So your brain is like a sponge for all these things. And which is not to say that you can't wring out that sponge, but sometimes it takes effort.
Mm-hmm.
So where the conscious mind comes in, I like to think of the conscious mind as having to deal with, it's almost like training an animal. And which is not to say that reason and emotion are completely split off, because you need the emotion in order to have good intentions in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Because your conscious mind is driven by emotions. So one thing that people all the way up until the 1800s used to say, particularly in Europe, was that emotions are bad or somehow irrational.
Mm-hmm.
And what we can now say, based on a lot of neuroscience, is that there are definitely excessive emotions or emotions that make you irrational, but that's not always the case. And without the emotional system, your decision-making processes can go completely out of whack. There was a researcher named Antonio Damasio who wrote a book called Descartes' Error, where he was talking about this error of splitting reason or rationality from emotion. And he showed that people who had damage to the emotional centers of their brain,
mm-hmm.
they didn't just become emotionless, they also found it really difficult to make decisions of any sort.
Because there wasn't a weight on one side or the other if it was neutral, right?
Precisely. It was intriguing because they could, like, if they were with an experimenter, they could tell you what all the pros and cons of various options were. So it was not like they had become stupid or anything. They were still capable of using their mental faculties,
mm-hmm.
but they just didn't have any way of voting for one option or another.
That totally makes sense to me. Just really quickly, just relating it to my own life, is one of the things that I've been trying to do more, because I'm a very emotional person, like excessively emotional person naturally. So I've been trying to learn how to, through meditation and stuff, sort of zoom out and observe things more before I make decisions. And I found that as I let go of some of my emotions around things, I get paralyzed when it comes to a thing where it's like, hey, that's actually kind of equally weighted rationally. So I, there's always solutions that come, because then I let my emotions kind of come back in and work through it, because otherwise you're just stuck, you're paralyzed.
Right. You hear these stories from people engaged in the different types of meditation, Buddhist meditation or Hindu meditation. And some people want to continue their normal lives of going to work and being a consumer and doing all these things. And a lot of these techniques, if you go back to their history, they were meant for ascetic lifestyles. So it's not entirely surprising that you become disengaged. Like sometimes you read articles about people who've had a bad experience of meditation, of being like zooming out too far, if you
mm-hmm.
like. And I don't think that is necessarily very common, but the fact that it happens, people should be aware of what the lineage of the meditation is and whether it suits the lifestyle that they're leading.
They want to lead.
Because, monks in various parts of the world do want to disengage. They do
mm-hmm.
want to not have immediate, strong desires to go towards or away from anything. And for instance, in ancient Hindu culture, they actually made stages of life, 4 stages of life. First, you're a child and a student. Then you're a householder and you raise your own children and work towards some goal. In stage 3, you start to withdraw a little bit and maybe start to contemplate religion. And in the stage 4, you go off into the wilderness and become a wandering mystic. So, which in some sense is a very middle-class approach to transcendence, which is first do your work and then become enlightened. So that's one way to think about it. But nowadays, with the internet and with all these apps and Buddhism and mindfulness and all of this is very accessible.
Mm-hmm.
So people are mixing and matching. It's a little bit like a buffet, right? You pick from all the different practices that exist. I'll have a little science. I'll have a little Taoism, a little Buddhism, a little Christianity. You can put all of it into a reasonably good meal for the soul.
Well, and actually that kind of leads to what I was going to ask. So originally you were saying how your particular field of neuroscience, and I'm so sorry I forgot the pre-titled, the something neuroscience, but you were saying that it sort of touches on spirituality and philosophy and all these different things. So like in your experience, helping people, talking to people, dealing with pop science and stuff like that, what is the thing that you've talked about that people find most surprising in relation to science and happiness or science and wellness?
I have not focused very much on happiness in my own research. And I know that there's since the 90s, there's been interest in something called positive psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, because people are interested in disorders, you tend to look at the other half, which is when those things go away.
Mm-hmm.
When people are unhappy or anxious. So you can kind of talk about this from the other side. I don't know whether I've necessarily surprised anyone, but there are some things that neuroscientists all sort of take for granted, but it hasn't been clearly expressed to people, which is like the plasticity of the brain. So recently the word neuroplasticity has become a little bit of like a buzzword,
Mm-hmm.
but the word plastic just means changeable. And in some sense, you can kind of infer that your brain is changeable from the fact that you can remember somebody's phone number or email address.
Mm-hmm.
Or the fact that when you watched your favorite TV show last night, you can still talk about it a week later.
Mm-hmm.
So most scientists are not dualists. They don't think that there's a separate floating soul.
Yeah, like mind-body duality, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that was a big, that was progress because all the way up until maybe the start of the 1800s, there were people, including scientists, who felt as though subjective experience and memory and everything that you learn is in the soul part.
Okay, yeah.
And then you kind of end up with this split where you overvalue the mental and you undervalue the physical. And that can cause a lot of morbid symptoms. On the one hand, you may not treat your body well, even if you have the opportunity to exercise and eat well. You may think, well, that's not really important. And on the other hand, in your interpersonal interactions, you may look down on people who are workers, who work with their hands, who work with their bodies, because you're like, oh, I am a mental worker. I'm so much superior to this bricklayer or this person who is working in a shop.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very unhealthy attitude, but it's pervasive. It's there all over the world. It's not just a Western thing. And what's cool about the scientific approach, even when we talk about stuff that we don't understand yet, is that we bring these two things back together again. Like there's a story by an anthropologist talking about some missionaries who were, I think, in South America. And they were trying to convince them of maybe the Bible and stuff like that. I don't think it was working out very well with this particular tribe. And the missionaries asked them, well, at least have we convinced you of the existence of the spirit or the soul? And the story goes that the response was, oh, we already knew about that. This new thing that you told us about is the body. So there is a form of integration where everything is in the domain of spirit. And I don't mean necessarily something that's supernatural or continues after you're dead, because that's a separate issue.
No, it's I think you mean like more like because the idea of like perception being reality and everything, that our body is just a vessel to carry us through this spiritual journey kind of idea, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. That totally makes sense.
And when you say just a vessel, you end up having a very almost ambivalent relationship to this thing in which you are.
That makes sense. And I mean, it is so complicated, regardless of what angle you look at it. Like, everybody I've talked to is like, well, it's not simple. Um, another question I have that is definitely something that of great interest to me, and I'll explain how I've come to interact with it with my very little knowledge, and you can definitely let me know if I'm just totally off base. But you were talking a little bit about emotions and their importance before, and one of the things that I think about emotions, or the way that I've viewed emotions throughout my life, is I almost view them as like tabs in a file folder, where my emotions are telling me what's important, not just to remember, but to filter in or to count in, right? Because when I look at times in my life, just like as an example, one of the things my dad used to say to me, and it's very obviously incorrect, but he used to say to me that that guys are only interested in me because they want to be physical with me and not be my friend. And I had all this different evidence. I had lots of male friends, and I had evidence that that wasn't true. But because what he said made me so emotional, whenever that thought came up, it sounded really true and it felt really true. So I don't know if theory is the right word, but the way that I relate to it is I think of them as page markers, where it's we have all this experience and emotions just kind of tell our brain where to go. Is that accurate at all, or way off base?
I think that's more or less how a lot of people see emotion. So if you want to recognize emotions in kind of the evolutionary history of our species, you have to think, well, what are simple emotions? What are the primordial emotions? And including in something like an amoeba or a really, really simple organism. And maybe just things like hunger and fear are very, very early emotions. If an animal is capable of approaching something, then they clearly have something like desire, whether it's for food or for a mate. And then at some point, animals develop the ability to run away, escape from a predator or from a bad circumstance, too hot or too wet or something like that. Then you have something like maybe a combination of fear and disgust. So you would tend to think that just the simple concept of moving towards and away are the primordial emotion-like states. Whether they are really subjective is who knows. But as you get more complicated with the vertebrates and finally with humans, you have culturally determined emotions. So you might have these primordial simple emotions to do with basic happiness, pain, fear, disgust. But then there are more complicated emotions that don't always have equivalence across cultures. And if you have never heard of Schadenfreude, which is getting happy at somebody else's sadness, do you actually feel it? It's a debate. It's hard to know.
Or another one that's really interesting is the honor, the sense of honor. You don't see that in all cultures, but definitely in some.
Yes.
So the reason that I'm interested in the emotions thing, I guess, is that when I'm looking at the idea of, retraining those filters, as I was talking about before, as you were talking about too, is that if emotions sort of work that way, even a little bit, where they sort of tag things in our brain,
right?
In theory, you might be able to somewhat retrain those filters by, applying, emotions, because, strong emotions like feeling good, feeling loved, feeling happy, recalling those things and bringing those emotions back to mind. But I don't really know. And I just, like I said, sort of wonder if there's any validity there, or if it's a bit obscure.
Yeah, I think that there's a theory called the somatic marker hypothesis, which is basically the tag idea that you were just saying, which is that things that come in, stimuli, impressions, objects that we've seen, people, we are constantly labeling them based on, in an unconscious way, based on the consequences of our interaction with them. And unlearning those tags can take a while. Even for animals, if an animal doesn't trust a person, it'll take a while for them to regain trust.
Mm-hmm.
With human beings, as you said, with what you were told by your father, it's complicated because one thing that language does is it gives us the opportunity to learn without having to go through lots and lots of experience. So most animals have to learn by a lot of trial and error. Especially for positive things. For bad things, you can learn from 1 or 2 bad experiences to fear something. And that's probably good from an evolutionary perspective, to quickly decide that something's dangerous. But with humans, we have this new system on the evolutionary timescale, which is I can share my experience with you in the form of language. So if I tell you, there's an ogre on the other side of the mountain, maybe you have not been to that side of the mountain, and for whatever reason, human beings are pretty biased towards believing everything they hear, especially
bad stuff.
Yes, but even good stuff. But and it's a very strange phenomenon. And I came across a set of psychology studies showing that, like, if I tell you the next sentence I'm about to tell you is false, and then I make some claim, the moon is made of green cheese, months later, in many circumstances, you'll remember that as true. Even though I explicitly told you that it's false. So statements that are framed as claims that such and such is true, even if I tell you before or afterwards that it is not true, we have a bias towards believing that they're true, particularly when we're distracted, which is really interesting.
Oh, that is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a 100% thing, but it's a bias.
Are biases, studied very much by neuroscience or theoretical neuroscience, or is that more in the field of psychology? Like, where is the divide?
It's more in psychology, just because we don't always have the ability to make measurements of the brain when these things are happening. But in social neuroscience, you do have psychologists basically using brain scanners. That's one way to think about it. So there's a continuum between psychology and neuroscience. And it all depends on the sort of data that someone's collecting. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with any sort of really clear data on which parts of the brain are involved in setting up biases, but you could have some guesses that they're the same areas involved in learning emotions. And learning, I don't mean learning emotions, I mean learning
through emotion,
the values of whether something is good or bad.
Okay.
Those are, in a sense, biases, because any specific experience you have is just one possibility in a large family of possible experiences you could have. So we do need to generalize somewhat in order to navigate the world. But we often generalize too much. Mm-hmm. Maybe you have one bad experience of food poisoning.
You're like, Wendy's are terrible.
Exactly.
I have, I lost it. I had one more question. I was going to ask, okay, we were talking about emotions, and I'm so sorry. I completely lost the last question, and I bet it was good. So before we move on to the super fun game where you're going to guess Australian slang, where can people find you so that they can read your research or read your information, what you're putting out to the world? Because it's obviously very valuable.
Thank you. You can find me. I have my website is yohanjohn.com, yohanjohn.com. And you can also find me on Twitter. If you go to my website, you'll also find it. That's Dr. Yohan John, I believe, is my handle, but that's on the website.
Okay, and is there anything you'd like to add before we play the game?
If I think of something, mention it later.
Okay, perfect. So are you ready? Are you ready to do some guessing?
Sure.
Okay, so what is footy?
Footy is football.
Yeah, it's soccer in America. Yeah, we say soccer here in Canada too.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so these are weird slangs. I picked a weird one. Okay, to be off one's face.
I think that means to be drunk.
Yes. Oh, you're really good at this. Oh, liquid laugh. I've never heard of that before.
Liquid laugh. Beer? I don't know.
It means to vomit. Isn't that gross? Wow. I hate it.
That's hilarious.
What's a veggie?
Vegetarian?
It is a vegetarian. You're so good at this. Okay. Most people do not get 3 out of 4. I think a lot of these are, that one I don't like. These are, what's a lolly?
A popsicle?
Very close. It's a lollipop.
Okay.
Actually, I have a question. This is unrelated to the game, but just quickly. What do you call those tubes of frozen juice where you're from? You know, like they're like a plastic tube. There's brand names like Mr. Freeze and stuff.
Tubes of frozen juice. We had them in India too. Sip-ups, maybe?
Okay, we call them freezies here. And I just recently learned that that's not what everybody calls them. And I was just very surprised. And then this one I use, even though it says it's Australian slang. And what are sunnies?
Those are sunglasses, right?
Yeah. And I always ask where are my sunnies? So thank you so much for joining me. And I really enjoyed it. And I really wish I could remember what that last question was. It was going to be a good one. And I just really appreciate helping us understand a little bit more about how this is related to the brain, and also that there's a lot that we don't know yet, and that's good too. Actually, I do have one more question. I'm so sorry. Oh wait, I already asked that. Never mind. I don't have a question. This is fun. Okay. So thank you very, very much, Yohan. And to my listeners, I love you. Bye.